So, this is a very formal session. No, this is. I'm Tom Rankin, and we're going to have a conversation. And my goal here is to try to get Tom Davenport to talk about sort of his trajectory into making films related to folk life and traditional culture, and to hopefully get him to talk about some things he hasn't talked about. We will eventually get to folk streams, but I've already warned him that I'm going to try to go back a little earlier and talk about some other things. I first met Tom. By the time we finish talking the introduction, you'll know everything you need to know. So I'm not going to do a formal introduction. But in 1980, as a very mature 23-year-old folklorist, I started working with Tom on a film, The Singing Stream. I was a first-year graduate student at UNC, and he was probably halfway into this film. I think he thought he was closer to finished, but as many films do, it went on and on. But it was it was really an amazing baptism into the process of making, at that time, a 16 mm double system film. And Tom works out of his farm studio house in Delaplane, Virginia, and so we would go back and forth between Chapel Hill, Creedmoor, where the film was being shot in Granville County, North Carolina, and his place. And Barry Dornfeld and I, Alan Tullis. And so I say that to say that Tom has mentored, sort of unintentionally maybe even, several generations. He's an old man. No, several generations of folklorists, of filmmakers, of media people. What I'd like to start with, though, Tom, I mean, you went to Yale as an English major, which is, on the one hand, the perfect sort of preparation to be a filmmaker, and on the other hand, there's something else has to happen. What took you into film? And why? And this microphone is going to pick up your voice for the film.
And when I graduated, I'm born in 1939, and I graduated from high school in '57, and then so the 1950s was my period, and graduated from Yale in '61, and at that time, people weren't interested in film at Yale. There was a film society there, and they would show regularly this film, Brunel film, you know, where they slice the eyeball, and the Salvador Dali film and stuff like that. And everybody would go down to see that and stuff like that. And they had a little arts theater, and I remember that too, as a kind of sort of idealistic person. They'd show these Swedish films, and they would have naked women in the films. And in those days, in American films, you couldn't have that sort of thing. And then after that scene, the entire football team would get up and leave. And that was the sensitive foreign films that we started. And I was always struck by those films, I suppose. And when I was a little kid, my parents lived in outside of D.C., and there was a theater in D.C. called the DuPont Theater, and they would play all these Italian New Wave films like The Bicycle Thief and things like that, that were very, very different from American films of that period. And they were almost, I can remember the feeling in that Bicycle. I was a little kid when I saw that Bicycle Thief and some of those films about after World War II and the loneliness of children and things like that. Probably wouldn't, people thought, well, you're crazy to let a kid see that, but they made an impression on me. And I was a mediocre student at Yale, and got toward the end of it, Yale, I just wanted to be with my friends and talk to them. I didn't care much about the courses at all. And that's kind of how I got started. And then I kind of drifting, you know, what am I going to do in my life? And I got appointed to go to Hong Kong. There's a program, Yale had a program, kind of like a Peace Corps program called Yale in China. And they'd send you out for 2 years to Hong Kong. There was some of you maybe may have heard of it. It's still running at Yale. and you teach English and coach and stuff like that. And while I was out there, I started taking still pictures. I got really interested in that, and because it was a foreign place, you're seeing everything new because it looks different to you, and so it's a common experience, I think, as a photographer, that you want to take pictures of things like that. And the cameras, you could buy these Nikon cameras cheaply in Hong Kong and stuff. I had an old Pentax. That was my first camera. And so then Vietnam War was heating up around this time. And I didn't want to go in the war. And I applied. I said, what am I going to do with myself? I applied to the East-West Center. I thought was an easy thing to figure out. They just set that up in the University of Hawaii to allow to sort of counteract the ugly American syndrome, where Americans were so provincial they didn't know anything about foreign countries, and they wanted.
Imagine that.
Yeah, at that time they wanted us to learn, so they took about a third of us were Americans, and the rest of them were people from South Asia and countries that we had relationship. We had no Chinese at that time because we didn't have a relationship with them, but they had Taiwanese and Pakistanis and people around Fiji and all those places. We're all brought together, and I went there and they let me in as a Chinese language student. And I got into the thing. It was a full scholarship, and they paid you like felt like a lot of money to live on as a young person at that time. Paid you to go there, and they said, you can't go now. They in the middle of things, you can't go. I said, why? Because you're so deficient in Chinese. All you know is spoken Chinese. You don't know how to write. You can't get a master's in Chinese. I said, well, you let me in, for God's sakes. So they said, all right, just come, you non-degree student. Do anything you want, sort of, basically. And while I was there, I started thinking, I said, I'm going to make myself I'm interested in photography. I like movies. Maybe I can study film. And I was so naive. I was thinking, well, Hawaii is out. It's even farther west than Hollywood. So there's probably this large film industry out there. I'm not knowing all this. There was nothing in Hawaii. It was like they would have a few guys that would do shots on the beach that they would cut into films about surfing and stuff. And so there was nothing there, and I began to go to the library and reading these books about filmmaking, but mostly looking at photographic books like the collections of Farm Security and Ansel Adams, not Ansel Adams, but Walker Evans and those kind of characters. And I was just fascinated. And then there was a professor who was visiting from Yale named Norman Ives. He's been long died, and he was on a sabbatical, and he said, you could take a course with me, and you can just go out and take pictures, and we'll discuss them. We'll discuss how you arrange pictures on a book. It was kind of like a film, you know, you would edit. Yeah. And so it's one thing, like it was I can't describe it. It was like a passion for me. Part of it was because I didn't know what I was going to be doing with my life. And then I discovered something that I could do fairly well. And it was just like I couldn't, I'd work, you know, sometimes I could be in the darkroom for 10 straight hours, you know, and I liked the meditative quality of developing things and the way the pictures were turned. Then the whole idea, I had a little motorcycle and drive out and you take these pictures, and then once or twice a week I would meet with Norman Ives. And Norman Ives said there was this wonderful photographer. Later on, I came back and visited him in New Haven. And I remember that meeting. He said, there's this wonderful photographer that was at Yale a little bit before you. And here's some pictures of it. He's a member of a band called the New Lost City Ramblers. And it was the photographs of John Cohen. Have you ever seen his still photographs? Well, they're really wonderful. And that, I didn't remember his name at all from that period, but anyway, that's kind of how I got started. And the first film, and I ended up going to New York and trying to make a living in New York, a filmmaker. I want to be a filmmaker. So I arrived in New York, and I had a friend named Tom Johnson who had graduated a couple years ahead of me at Yale. And he said, well, you could get a job maybe with Leacock and Pennybaker. They're these new filmmakers that are doing these with these portable cameras, different kind of way for cinema.
Ricky Leacock and
Rick,
D.A. Pennebaker.
Yeah. And so I got a job with them for $50 a week in their business. And I met a lot of young people there, and everybody was very excited about filmmaking then and all this.
What were they working on then? Do you remember?
They were working.
This is what year?
This was probably in the mid '60s in that area.
So Don't Look Back came out in '65.
Yeah, but might have been that film was around at that time,
Uh-huh.
and I remember what I did. I mean, all I did was work in the equipment side, and they were moving their office from one place to the other, and I was younger and stronger, and I moved all this equipment down 5 flights and up 5 flights to the new office. This very heavy stuff. And then I thought, well, you know, I can speak Chinese. Maybe I should start doing documentary work, and that would be a natural go back to Hong Kong or China, Taiwan at that time. So I went back. Part of the East-West Center was they sent us to Taiwan, and then I went back again after that, and I had a little stipend from National Geographic. I showed up. I remember my meeting with the guy at National Geographic, the head of the photo department. It was so discouraging because I was very, again, idealistic. He said, you know, if you get any bare-breasted women, he said, that's really sells the magazine. That was like so nutty. I mean, and I thought, yes, right, well, of course. And so he said, you can have all your film, here we'll give you $500, and you can have we'll do all the color film you need, and we'll develop it for you. So I went out to Taiwan, and on the way out there, I'm rambling around. These things are popping in my mind. I stopped in and did a workshop with, who's that guy on the West Coast? It's kind of he was very big still cameras. I can't remember his name now to pop in my mind. Not Ansel.
Weston.
Huh?
Edward Weston.
No. A little stranger than that. And he was later. And anyway, they were people working with large cameras, and it was all about developing and force developing and all the kind of stuff you could do in the darkroom. But anyway, I went out there, and I didn't quite want to do. I had color film and I do black and white film. And I didn't want to do the National Geographic thing, so I did a lot of stuff which I thought was more interesting. But there was a part of me who wanted to do the National Geographic stuff, and I set aside, here are the important things about Taiwan. I sort of analyzed it like a autodidact, you know, their industry, their agriculture, their stuff like that for that. And I would go around and make half-hearted attempts and shoot color in that. But then I did a lot of black and white pictures that I was trying to be more like Cartier-Bresson or those kind of things. And I was out there about 7 or 8 months, working pretty hard. And I got a letter from National Geographic that said, it's over. We don't want you to take any more pictures. We're sending a staffer out to complete the job. So here I'd spent all this time. It was a lot of time for me as a young person. And so I had nothing to show for it. I was so depressed. And Taiwan had this, especially in Taipei, they had this, they burned a lot of coal when they cooked. And so the whole place was very foggy and cold, and there was no heat. And I was living in with a Chinese family of friends from East-West Center, and I was almost neurotically depressed. And I said, well, I got to come back with something. I was ambitious person, And I remembered that I'd seen this guy, Nanhui Jin, who had been a Buddhist scholar. He was a refugee from the mainland, and he did Tai Chi Chuan, you know, that thing like that. It looked like a dance. I mean, he didn't know anything about it at that time in the United States, and but it's a form of self-defense. And I said, let's go out and make a film about this. And so I gathered up some cameras from the United States Information Agency. And I was running around with a bunch of artists in Taiwan at that time. I remember my former roommate, Liu Daren, they did a staging of Waiting for Godot in Chinese. Can you imagine that? I was sort of in touch. I was taking a lot of pictures in that world. It was very exciting in some sense. But anyway, I made this film, and that was my first film. We filmed it, and I came back to the United States, and we got a little money from the Rockefeller Foundation to edit it, and that became the film Tai Chi Chuan, which is
Your first film.
First film, and I learned how to. I got a little editing machine, and I rented a little moviola and edited it. It was a very simple film, and worked with a soundtrack with a Yale classmate of mine who was an avant-garde composer named Tom Johnson, and he did this rather weird soundtrack out of white noise, static electricity, and clappers. He was interested in wind
This
chimes.
is 1970. Is that the date of that film?
Probably that was in the late '60s, really. And that was the first film, and from there I started making other films, and I'll go into those.
So and at that point, did you move back to Virginia?
Around 1970, we moved back. My girlfriend, Mimi, had come down from. She'd come down from a failed marriage in Boston, and we had a bunch of young friends in those days, and we all ate at this little restaurant in Little Italy called Puglia, where you get family food. Everybody would sit down, and they'd serve what they had to serve, and it was really, really inexpensive. And I met her at a party there with a bunch of people from Cornell and Yale, and she was a Cornell graduate, and she was looking for a job, and I had a little paying job from the United States Information Agency. The United States Information Agency in those days was interested in countering, it was in the Cold War, so they were trying to do all these films about what America was like and how open we were in our agriculture and so forth. And they gave us some money to do a film on maple syrup collection. And and so, and I remember when we made that film, they had to be in 35 millimeter, and it had a VW bug, and we filled that thing. We went up to Vermont. It's a wonder we survived. I had that whole thing filled with about a ton of these gigantic cameras and tripods and all this kind of stuff, and we drove up there. And I was running, and in those days, there was running around. I had a bunch of friends at the New York University Film School there, and this guy, Jan Welt, was there, and he told me, he said, you know, this guy made this film about the French bibliothèque. And he said, how in the hell you do a film about the French bibliothèque? I mean, really hard thing to do a movie on. So he said, the guy came up with this metaphor. I said, what's that? I never saw this film, but the idea was intriguing. And he said the metaphor was that the bibliothèque was a prison where they kept the ideas of great men. So the whole film was framed like, you know, doors clanking, and everything, you can't get in. We might get into this issue with folk streams and universities later on, but anyway, and archives. But the whole idea of the film was framed on this kind of metaphor. The metaphor, visual metaphor of the prison. So I went up there to this maple syrup thing and said, oh, God, I can't just do a film, like happy people. What is the metaphor? So I said, it's the rape of a tree. And I would do this. We cut this film,
I don't think I've ever seen this film.
No. So we came back. So we came back to New York, and we went down, and I had a rough cut. I showed I went down to the USA agency, and they're sitting there. It's like, okay, thank you very much, and here's your money. And then they finally cut it themselves, and the title was "Sweets from Trees." So, but anyway, that's when and Mimi was working for. She was came down that I sort of hired her as a helper at the time, and we drove down and we were friends, but didn't know each other that well. But I remember that she drove down with me to Washington D.C. from New York in the little car. And you know how it is when you're in a car, sometimes with people, it's very intimate and you talk a lot and everything. And I got to know her, and it was very friendly. She liked my family. And she said, especially my father, she said, and I said, why did you marry me? She said, well, I figured your father was so nice you couldn't be all bad. So she stuck it out. Yeah. But anyway, she was a film student too. She eventually ended up being she was a guy. There was a critic in New York by the name of Manny Farber who was a very irascible guy. He was a guard in an art museum. He was a painter himself, and she was his favorite student. And so anyway.
You mentioned your father. I think it's. Can we go back just to talk a little bit about the influence? I mean, you went back to the farm your father sort of established,
my father and mother.
And your father was a New Deal agriculture.
Yeah, my father was raised in Norfolk, Nebraska, and he was the youngest in the family and the darling of the family. Really, he had two sisters and a brother. And my father was born in 1905, so he remembers working with his grandfather, and his grandfather telling him when they went out west that you could see buffalo as far as you could see in those plains. And he'd tell me those stories, and it was just wonderful. But he was my grandmother on that side was a real staunch Protestant, and they when they drove through these Catholic towns in Nebraska, they'd be told, the kids would be told, lie down, those Catholics have guns in the parish houses, they'll shoot at you, And she was a big temperance person. My father always used to sing Dry Up Nebraska, where you are, you'll save a sailor from the bar. And he was an Eagle Scout, very successful athlete, went to the University of Nebraska, was on the track team, was on the world's record, held the world's record in the half-mile relay with a sprinter named Locke for a while. And he was a straight arrow kind of guy, but in the Depression hit in 29, he had a complete kind of an awakening to sort of the what he felt was the weakness of religion and the importance of social action. It was very much in tune with his religious accents of the person. And so he was influenced by that and he worked in cooperative movements in Chicago and South Bend, Indiana. And he also decided that he was going to have a marriage contract. So he drew up this marriage contract with, I got a copy, Mimi's got a copy of it. I've got to get it out sometime, but it had every little thing on it. How much money, what you would do with the money, how much time in the evening you would devote to intellectual pursuits and reading, who would do the cooking, this kind of, it was very, I guess there was stuff about children, no children in the first 3 years and all that kind of stuff. And he had a lot of girlfriends. My father was a drag, but can you imagine how romantic that would be? Here, you want to sign? And my mother signed it. But my mother was a Hungarian immigrant from a very poor family in South Bend, Indiana. There was a factory there, the Oliver Plow Factory, that made plows, and it was a big industrial thing at that time. And her father had come over, and then her mother had gotten her mother to come over, and the rest of the children were 9 she had 9 siblings, and she was the next to the youngest. And she was kind of she had a vision of the Virgin Mary when she was a young woman, and her father wanted her to become a nun. And totally opposite of my father's Protestant background. And she wasn't allowed to speak English at home. They spoke Hungarian, and they all went to these Hungarian clubs in South Bend, and she decided she wasn't going to have anything to do with that. So she ran away from home when she was 15 and got a job in what's called a bait factory. I didn't know what that was, but that's the thing where they made fishing lures and painted the fishing lures. And while she was there, she was taken under the wing of an American family named Burroughs, and they sort of treated her like a daughter. And her aspirations were typical of an immigrant of that period. She didn't want to have anything to do with it, and she wanted.
Why hadn't you made a film about all of this?
Well, I've got some footage of this stuff. I did an interview with my mother one time. She talked about her life in South Bend. In her later life, she got Alzheimer's, and my father took care of her. And I took this video one time, and it was back in the 90s, high 8 or something like that, and I showed it to her when she had Alzheimer's, and she paused and she watched that thing. She said, "Who is that woman? She certainly knows a lot about me."
That's beautiful.
But the two of them complemented each other in a way, because my father was I always thought my father was he was the responsible one. He made the money. He started this thing, eventually started a housing project in Washington, D.C. that's very famous now, called Holland Hills. It was a very modern architecture, and now it's like...
It's on the National Trust.
Yeah, National Trust, and I mean, it's almost like when you go down and visit at the garden shows, there's thousands of people that come to these things and visit Holland Hills, and it's sort of I never liked those houses very much, to tell you the truth, but they're very much still in the news. I think every year there's a big Washington Post article about Holland Hills and stuff like that. But my mother and father worked together, and she did bookkeeping, and they bought the farm with the money that came from that. In 1970, they bought this 1,000-acre farm, derelict farm in the mountains of Virginia.
Which is where you live now.
Which I live now. And so when I left New York to come down to Virginia, my father had bought a neighboring farm of about 50 acres for $20,000 that had an old house on it from about pre-Civil War, but it was about the time of the Civil War. It was built by a Methodist minister. It was a frame house, and it was really falling. You could throw a cat through the walls, probably. Practically, there was no insulation or anything. And he had the leftover. He was winding down Holland Hill, so he had a lot of leftover materials, and he brought the crew out there, and he fixed it up, and he told me that if I could, Mimi and I had a little money because she had a divorce settlement, and if I gave him $10,000, that would pay for the whole restoration of that house. So here we were with having a 50-acre place with a big house. It was a big house. You've been there, Tom, and no mortgage. I didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. And when we moved down, we'd gotten a grant to do the Shakers from Ann Rockefeller and
Documentary.
That's a second documentary. That's how I met Dan Patterson, and that film. I bought a Steenbeck editing machine. I said, well, we can edit this thing at home, and set it up in the basement there. And we set up this Steenbeck editing machine, great big old flatbed thing like this, and I edited. It was a very, very interesting kind of. We were sort of on the cutting edge of things, because nobody would think you could make a film outside of New York or Washington D.C. or Hollywood. It was impossible to think you working at home on a film, because the complex relationships you had with laboratories and the skill sets that you had. But I said, maybe we can do it. And then I said, well, what are we going to do? Are you going to get a job? And I said, well, maybe if we if we distribute our own films, we can make a living at home. Just like I said, look, people sell cane chairs out of their houses and rugs and things like that. Why not movies? And it turned out that was really the thing to do, because there weren't but about maybe 2,000 public libraries and universities that collected films in those days. And films were expensive. You had to send them, you had to make these prints, and you had to send these prints out, and they reviewed them. But if you made a film sale, it would be like, today's equivalent, like $1,000. You make $1,000 on one sale of one film. So if you sold 100 of them,
To libraries. Mostly.
yeah, libraries, because they had review committees and stuff like that. You could do it. This is how Les Blank worked. This is how he distributed his own films that way. And so we set up this business of selling these films. You'd send out preview prints, and you'd get them back, and you'd clean them, and then you'd mark down where they'd been, and then they had have committees in the library to decide whether they'd buy them. And there was only a few film festivals at that time. The American Film Festival was the biggest one, and if you got a blue ribbon in that, you were guaranteed to sell a whole lot of movies. So you could make a living in those days selling your films at home, and that was a big factor in.
And were you farming as well?
Well, very light farming, because my father ran the main farm and we had a small farm. So I had a milk cow, and we had a milking goat when the kids were small, and we had chickens. We did all that kind of hippie stuff, from this is 1970.
First cup of coffee you brought me when I stayed there, he said, "This has goat milk in it. I hope that's okay." Yeah.
Yeah, I used to think. But with that cow, I had these Jersey cows, and Jersey cow, I had 3 boys, and we could drink easily a gallon of milk. So what's a gallon of milk? About $4, $3 now. So you fill 365 by 4.
This begins to sound like that marriage contract.
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. And then you could sell the calf and pay for all the feed from that. And I liked to milk that Jersey cow. It was very sensual. You go out there, you'd get the cow would never let her milk down. So I'd fool her, and I'd bring her in with her calf, and the calf would, if the calves, they butt the mother like that if the mother isn't letting their milk down, and then all of a sudden you'd see like that, and then the calf, and then he paid her, she'd let her milk down, and then immediately I had a halter on this calf. I'd drag the calf off, and then I'd get in, and all the slobber would be on, his slobber would be on those cow tits, and and it would foam, look like a cappuccino. And it was greatest milk in the world, except in the spring when they eat a lot of spring onions, and it all tastes like onions. And so that was the Tom raises goats now. I got to remember that that started him off, that cup of coffee.
Get the credit or the blame.
That was a very interesting period, I'm jumping out everywhere.
Tom does that.
Yeah. I had my first child was Robert, and Robert got the croup. You know what that is? It's a disease, a respiratory disease. It's very severe, and in those days, they sent him. He had to go to the hospital. And the parents couldn't stay with him. I mean, you're taking a kid of 1 or 2 years old, and you're sending him to the hospital and putting him in an oxygen tent. No parents could come. They didn't want parents to interfere with the doctors, And so when he got out of that, this probably messed up Robert for the rest of his life. Anyway, he got out of that. I said, I remember my mother used to read to my sister and me these old fairy tales from the blue book and the red book, those Lang things. They were very kind of English type collections of things. And I loved those things. It was as a little kid. We would always sit on the couch, she'd read. And I said, well, what's the story about abandonment? We would abandon Robert. And the kids got over it. So, well, Hansel and Gretel. Oh, that's a story about being left in the forest all by yourself. And the kids survive. So So I started reading the story. Matthews, he had a little brother named Matthew, and they started listening to the story. Man, I must have read that story and told it like you do with kids, over and over and over again. And then suddenly I said, we were working on The Shakers at that time. And The Shakers is a movie that, like a lot of documentaries, it's carried by the audio. It's not a visual film. The Shakers will be interviewed and things like that. And I was reading a lot about and thinking a lot about those early Russian silent movies that are done where it's the cutting, it's the juxtaposition.
Like Man with a Movie Camera?
Well, and the Battleship Potemkin and stuff.
Right.
And those things where, and then Manny Farber, this guy I was telling you about in New York, I had an incident where I was showing a film. He'd asked me to check out because we had a projector up in the place where I was editing this film, and he'd watch a film without the soundtrack. He watched these old Orson Welles films and he cut off the sound. I said, Manny, what the hell are you doing that for? He said, look, if it's a film and it's going to be carried as a film, you should follow it without the sound. That's an extra thing. If the film's going to carry itself, it's going to carry itself visually. And, that's a interesting way of thinking about it. So I had in my mind that I would make this, I said, I could make that film, Hansel and Gretel, and if I updated it to an Appalachian setting, I could do it in my backyard. Wouldn't cost a whole lot of money, and I bet I could do it almost like a silent movie. Carry it make a film. I was so sick of the Shakers where you're cutting according to what the sound was, what the interview was, and so forth. So could we cut the thing to it all go together like a silent movie? I'll cut it without the sound. I'll make it without sound. We'll dub the sound in later. So I didn't get nobody had any lines hardly in the movie. So we did it, and very on nothing. I mean, just sometimes they didn't even put the camera on a tripod. We were, in those days, everybody kept the camera on a tripod because they were heavy and that was what you did. But I set this thing with this demented witch, and I said, well, the witch and the stepmother are really the same person, but they're different manifestations of that. Was a kind of, I'm reading a lot of that. So we finished that thing up, and I dubbed it in and so forth, and didn't know when. I sent it up to New York to a group called, they had a woman by the name of Maureen Gaffney, and there was another woman. She was working with another woman who became much better known. Her name was Jerry Laybourne. She ran that KidsNet cable network forever, and she became a huge mover and shaker in the world of children's and women's film. And they were testing films in New York City, and they showed Hansel and Gretel in these inner city kids, this Appalachian movie, and they said they just loved it. They come back and loved it. Whereas the older librarians in the older library world, they said this is too crude a film. It's frightening. You can't show this thing. And they kind of panned it. But Jerry Laybourne and Maureen Gaffney championed it. They had this little organization for children's films, and they wrote a book called Films Kids Like, and this was their star film. And I realized that, that's really great. And just in those days, if you distributed a children's film, all the libraries wanted it. Not like a documentary on the Shakers, but there was the children's things with 16 millimeter. They would check them out for birthday parties and stuff like that. But it was a very controversial film. I mean, I showed that film sometimes and had parents jump up and say, turn that projector off. I don't want my kids to see it. And it's like being banned in Boston. It created a lot of buzz for the films. And we went on to make a whole series of these fairy tales that could be set in these American settings that were very close.
All grim fairy tales.
Yeah, well, they were sort of grim and related to them. And the first ones were very much followed the grim fairy tales, but then we got into one of them called Jack and the Dentist's Daughter, and it's a Jack tale, and the version in Richard Chase's book is Jack and the Doctor's Gal. But that fit the American milieu. We did it with a black cast and played with difference and gradations of color and the whole social aspirations of the time, and we fooled around a lot. That was a very breakthrough film because and it was longer than the others. And I've discovered that these little 20-minute films were more difficult to do because you'd have to, if you did a 20-minute film, you still had to cast everything, costumes, you had to find the location, you had to do all the scripting and everything like that. But if you did an hour film, it was a lot easier because once you cast it and did it, it lasted longer. You didn't have to do it every 20 minutes. So we were able to do longer films, and they eventually ended up in the last film we did was a very elaborate version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs called Willa in American Snow White, which we set in a Willa is Willa is this girl that has aspirations for theater, and she ends up in a traveling medicine show. And I had done a film on Born for Hard Luck on and he knew a lot about traveling medicine show. She's in a traveling medicine show in which there is a dwarf and a gay Indian and a failed Shakespearean actor. These are the three, like Wizard of Oz. And they take in Willa, and she becomes a star and everything. But that was the last one we did, and the endowment at that point was shifting funding.
NEA.
Yeah. Well, this was NEH.
Okay.
And NEH was shifting because at this time, Ken Burns had come along with the Civil War series. And every bit of funding went right out of the independent films of that period. And we couldn't get any funding much. So that was the end of that era of the dramatic films. I still, piddled around in that stuff, but I didn't do it.
I want to go back to your meeting Dan Patterson. Talk about the sort of evolution of working with Dan on the Shakers and then this long collaboration with UNC.
Does everybody know who Dan Patterson is? He's a remarkable person. And what happened was we started a film. I met a guy in New York by the name of Frank DiCola, and he was working for the NFL, making films for the NFL. They would shoot films at the time, cut these things in. But he was really a composer, and he was a very dark, brooding guy, interesting guy. But he asked me if I could work with him on a film going to New Orleans. It was The Cradle is Rocking is the name of that film, and go down and shoot that film for him, and again 35 millimeter film, which we did. And it's a very nice film. Frank cut it's extremely polished movie. But shortly after that, he said, let's collaborate. I told him that I was really interested in the Shakers, that I'd come back to from the Far East, and I got interested in Zen Buddhism, and I'd seen all those Japanese pictures of those Japanese temples. You ever seen those Japanese temples? How clean and had that kind of wonderful aesthetic sense. And I saw this book of Shaker architecture, and the Shaker architecture and the Zen temples looked like they were similar. I was really very looking for meaning in my life, and this was the beginning of a long religious quest. And and I said, "There's a similar."
Which is really why we're here.
Yeah, you're right. Don't worry, we'll get to that part. But anyway, the Shakers, and so I went to Frank after the other one. Said, I'm really interested in their music. They have all this wonderful music that came out, these hymns that came out of that period in the mid-19th century, and I'm interested in it. And he said, there's this guy down in Chapel Hill who's done work on Shaker music. I didn't know who he was. I didn't. But Frank said, I'm interested in doing that. So we went in there and we said, I've got this connection through the people that funded the Tai Chi Chuan film, the Rockefeller Foundation. So they introduced us to Anne Rockefeller. I'll never forget that meeting. It's a good story. Yeah. Frank and I went out to Anne Rockefeller. We went to this place called Benihana's, where the people chop thing and fry it on a skillet like that. And she was older than we were, and she's the daughter of Nelson Rockefeller. And she asked us about the film, and she said she'd had an interest in that. And we were introduced by this guy Porter McRae, who was this, ran the J.D. Rockefeller, the Third Fund, and they had funded the Tai Chi Chuan film, and I was one of his boys. He's from Virginia too, so he was a little bit on the gay side, so he kind of liked me, you know. I think and so he wanted to, we were part of his troupe, so he entered this meeting, and Ann turned to us. We hadn't done any filming or anything, talked to the Shakers at all. And she said, well, I'm going to put in $5,000. Are the Shakers for this film? And I said, oh, yeah, they really want it made. Yeah. And so, well, we started corresponding with the Shakers. Well, one group, there was a big rift between the two groups. There were two surviving groups of Shakers, one at Canterbury, New Hampshire, and the other in Sapsday Lake, Maine. And they didn't get along. They were fighting in this place like this. And they said they'd want a film made, and you kidding? We don't want a film made. But we'd already said, we lied, and we'd gotten ourselves into this situation. We had to dig ourselves out. It was like the story of Bearskin when he makes a deal with the devil. He doesn't know what he's going to get into. And we had to dig ourselves out of this hole, so we had to persist. Oh, no, you could please let us in. And we got, and then in the process of this, Frank got brain cancer. And we finally got permission to go up to Canterbury and film them. And then Frank gets brain cancer and dies. It's a terrible death, and his marriage breaks up and everything. And so he was going to be the editor, I was going to be the photographer. And so the editor is really the key thing in a documentary. So so I had to edit the thing. So we got permission to, we had this footage from Canterbury. And finally, the Sapsday Lake said, we don't want the Canterbury to have the final say. We want to have our say, because we want to keep the society open. They wanted to close the Shakers. We wanted to carry it on. So we got in that way through this rivalry. And the fact is that, again, I contacted Dan because Frank had been in touch with Dan. And then after Frank died, I said, do you think we can get together on this? And I'll never forget that. We went down to, I drove down, my sister was in art school at Greensboro, and we drove down to Chapel, that area, and we met in Hillsboro, where Tom lives, at a little restaurant and a hotel there.
Colonial Inn.
And I still remember that because Dan and I got so excited. I'd never met him before. And if you know, he's a very polite person, very cautious and thoughtful. But he was taken with the idea that film could represent folk things better than text, because at that time it was all text. So we decided to collaborate. I remember that meeting because both of us had about 8 cups of coffee, and by the time was over, it was like I was sparking lightning bolts out the end of my fingers. I know it. And Dan has a terrible sweet tooth at that time. We were eating sugar and drinking all that coffee. And and there was a very interesting meeting, and it was very, very, when you look back on your life, there's certain things that you pick out. Who knows what it was? Maybe just the air conditioning that you hear now. But in that you pick out those sort of seminal events in your life, and that was one of them. That began this wonderful collaboration. And Dan Patterson, if those of you who have been in students of his or know him, he's a marvelous writer, but what he really has that is a gift is he's able to see the importance of things. There's a lot about folklore I find extremely petty, but Dan doesn't. He sees it in the broader pictures of things. And I wasn't interested in folklore much at that time. Still not. But I was interested in stories that made a difference in how people lived and how they thought of themselves. And that, whether there was folklore involved in it or not, that's okay. That was a dressing on the thing. But the skeleton had to be something that you cared of, some archetype of thing that that really made the film or the work, the story that you could, so a person could look at that and say, I'd like to be a member of that family, or this is how you should live. This is what's important. And that was the thing that he was able to tell, and I think in all of his students, he inspired them that way, because he, Bill, and that's what he was able to do, and he still is able to do that. We work on these grants together, and he is a marvelous editor and writer, and in the old school, and he's able to. And if you look at the about folk streams and things like that, a lot of his text and the press points and so forth about why it's important. Mm-hmm. This is what he's really revealed for everybody who's worked with him. This is a gift he has, and for all his modesty, it's a terrific gift. He also, one time, I'll tell you a funny thing. We were working on a film. He just loved this film. He got involved. We got one of his students named Joyce Jones was a
Joyce.
Joyce, yeah. Her dad was a real good storyteller. Lived up in the mountains in Wilkes County, and a kind of fighter. He won. John Jones, her father, on a bet one time. Somebody bet him that he couldn't carry 6 bags of 100-pound bags of feed. He had one under each arm, 2 on his shoulder, and 1 in his teeth. And he could walk around this general store, and he won the bet. He was a big, strong guy, and he had a big religious conversion that was confusing Joyce and the family a great deal. It was a violent religious, I mean, the stories are like he came out of his head and went up in the air, and he saw his body down, looked like a cupid owl, he said. And Dan was really interested in these stories because he's told all these stories. It looked like he like Mark Twain come alive or something. And so we did that film together. And one time, Dan and I went up there. We're in a motel. We'd never traveled much together, but we did spend the night in a motel. And Dan was telling me about something, and he said to me, I was trying to make a living as a filmmaker. And he said, anything that's worthwhile you can't make any money from. What? I'm thinking, Jesus, I'm trying to make a living. I have an entrepreneurial bent. I have a trickster side of my character, I think, that I have, that's very complimentary of Dan. Because Dan is, it's the book. And any time that I started doing things really bad, they trust Dan. And then something has to be done really radical, like when we made the Singing Stream film. It started off as a film about gospel singing. Well,
about a gospel group.
Gospel group, and we'd interview. Well, how do you start the song? Where do you get your music from? Are you influenced by country music? Oh, so boring. And we were sitting there, and I came back. I remember that time. Alan Tullis was, and Alan Tullis at that time. Is Peggy here? Peggy Yoakum? No.
No.
She's here, but she was Alan Tullis's girlfriend. And I was giving her a ride back we were coming back from I said, this is the most depressing movie. It's never going to work. Usually what happens is a filmmaker or I guess any artist or even writing your PhD over there, there's a point where you think this is a piece of shit. And it is the worst thing in the world, and nothing can redeem it. It's the end. It's the bottom of the pit. And at that point, you're ready to change. And I was sitting in the bus. I said, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work out. And I remember Peggy was on the bus. And I said, and I was thinking, we met Mrs. Landis out there. There was a scene where she's sweeping the thing with that broom. And she was, that's good. That was good stuff. And I said, we've got to change the whole thing. We've got to change the film. Dan had talked to all the Golden Echoes. They were some members of the family, some weren't members of that family, Landis family. We made arrangements. They were going to be famous. It's going to propel their gospel group into the stars. I said, Dan, we're not going to make the film about the Golden Echoes anymore.
NEA thought the Golden Echoes was the film too.
Yeah, we had to lie to them. And so we So no, I said, we change it. It's not going to, they won't care if it's a good film. And if you can get the things, oh, you make it right, Dan. No, I didn't say that, but I got John, the person that was really helpful on that was John Landis. And John Landis was an entrepreneur, if there ever was one. And he said, listen, I'll handle it for you, Tom. And he
Who's
did
the lead of the Golden
Echoes. And he was a guy, he made a lot of money at the time selling the videos when it finally came out. And so he arranged it with the Golden Echoes, so it wasn't a disaster. And because they were all counting on it, and then suddenly you shift it from the Golden Echoes to his family. His family. So it was a lot of negotiating that had to go on. And we got through that, but there was a real, Dan said, oh, you can't possibly do that. You can't.
But the Echoes are still a major part of the film.
Oh, yeah, they're a major part of the film. In fact, the best part of the Echoes came, we filmed the Echoes several times, and Bill Mansfield was up there. And were you there the last time after?
It was in that gymnasium, and I was up there.
Yeah, and of course it's a gospel shout. He's sitting there in his T-shirt and blue jeans with holes in it. Of course, everybody and it's like a church service, black church service, everybody dressed to the nines. It's very, very important how you wear your clothes. And all these folklorists look raggedy-taggedy. and we're filming. Tom and I were filming. We were filming this amazing thing happened. We'd filmed 3 times down there, and the performances and everything were mediocre.
Right. The place just exploded.
Exploded because what had happened was one of the Echoes had been murdered by his wife, Green. I think his name was.
Yeah, his first name is. I think. It's
Yeah,
second.
but anyway, we'd filmed a lot of him, and he'd gotten a domestic fight with his wife. She knifed him and killed him, and so this happened a couple of months before the concert. So they had a substitute singer in the quartet, and everybody was aware of this. There's a pent-up amount of emotions that came from this story that was behind the thing, and it exploded. And what happened in that film? There's video.
In a high school gym.
It's an high school gym. I brought a lot of DVDs to give away to everybody. You can go into some places. They're supposed to have them.
They're back in the back.
Yeah, and you can take one. And there's a scene. Tom and I were filming, and we had 2 cameras, and Tom was doing one on a tripod, I think.
No, I had a handheld. but
Well,
it doesn't
anyway,
matter.
he ran out of. You had about 10 minutes
10
on the
10
film,
minutes on
and
the
it
reel.
took you a long time. You had to change the magazine. It was complicated, and I had a shot, and he had run out, and then John got up singing, and his niece had come down from Akron with a bunch of her singing bunches. They knew the song, and she just sort of spontaneously got up there and started singing, and Tom wasn't shooting. I had this one camera, so everything, I don't know what it was. It was one of those things that you clicked. It was like being in a dance where you couldn't make the wrong move. It was like, everything is worked. And
Microphones being passed back and forth.
and back and forth.
The lead mic.
And it was like, oh my God. And then Brett Sutton, you remember him from, well, he was doing the sound. And Brett was looking at the sound thing, so he pulled everything down even. And so the whole 8 double track thing we had there was no dynamics.
It was flat.
Flat. You couldn't get anybody higher than anybody else because one group was all on one mic. We had two. We only had a stereo Naga, and so all the instruments and backup people were on one, and all the singers were on one, and he wouldn't. So you couldn't adjust between these singers, and so the lead singer was really powerful. Was not any louder than the backup singers, and it was a terrible mix. I mean, Brett must have felt horrible by the thing because he was
Really
looking at the
worse when
dial.
he hears that you talked about.
Yeah. So that's a funny story about that's how the singing stream got, because we were going to do a film and told him, well, we switched to the subject on you. But anyway, Brett, and so we had to go back and actually dub. We went into a studio, and it was
So-
all spontaneous.
This is amazing.
And you can see it. It's a little out of sync in places like that, but you don't care.
But the Landises were able to just sort of lock into, I mean, it
Yeah.
was a year or a year and a half later.
Yeah.
They go in the studio, they hear the bad recording, you know,
Yeah.
the sort of flat recording. They see what they're doing, and they just go straight into.
So, you know, I mean, it was all spontaneous. It wasn't like they were scripted or they were
No.
reading anything. So it was
Do
amazing.
you think the fact that you could even, that you were willing to do that, I think there's some filmmakers that wouldn't have been willing to do that. And
Well,
did that have, you know, you had made these other sort of dramatic films like the which you've talked about,
yeah.
the Grimm's films, but so being willing to kind of go, and you had Dan Patterson, who Dan feels like the most unethical thing you can do in a music film is to present somebody who's usually on key, slightly off key. In other words, if they have a bad day, you can't use that footage. He's so protective of them, and
Yeah.
and there was something. You
yeah.
remember those conversations?
Well, he was.
He's such a purist when it comes to
Yeah.
sort of how he wants
I
the
think-
subjects to appear.
You know, it's me and Dan was like Jack Sprat could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean. Together they licked the platter clean. I think was a good combination between us two.
Yeah.
And I know, I mean, one of the things that happened out of this, all those students like Tom and Bill Mansfield, I mean, you know, it's like he's at the National Endowment for the Arts now. It's like bribery. No, no, I'm just kidding. But you know that this he's very friendly with me at the National Endowment for the Arts. But what this does is all these students is there's a backlog of talent and that came out, especially in that period. Everybody was countercultural slightly in the 70s and 80s, and there was a feeling that folklore was really vital at that time.
Well, and for some of us that didn't want our work to just be limited to the page, there were no programs that were combined film, photo,
Yeah.
folklore programs. And so I can remember going to Dan and saying, I'm not sure I want to go into folklore graduate school because I may want to go to get an MFA in photography. And he said, well, we've got this guy, Tom Davenport, who's not really teaching here, but he's kind of here. And it was a way to expand the curriculum in a kind of evolutionary way that wasn't happening at a lot of other places. And I think Dan saw that probably at that lunch when y'all had too much coffee.
I don't
He saw
know
that
what-
potential.
It was something he because he talks a lot about the influence of the recording machine too,
Right.
and affecting folklore and of course in the ballads and everything like that. But now, of course, we're dealing. Dan's almost 90 years old, so we are talking.
We just had his 90th birthday
Yeah.
dinner the other night.
So now we're into stuff like blockchain and PHP coding and all these kind of esoteric
Well,
elements.
let's talk a little. I don't know how long we have in here, but I want to get to folks. Yeah.
Before we do that, Tom, would you just say a little bit more about that New Orleans film that you did with your friend who died?
Well, we went down there in Mardi Gras, and Frank was going to do this film, and he went out. It was sponsored by the United States Information Agency. They had a thing called, I can't remember his name, but anyway, they were giving awards to filmmakers, young filmmakers, to make these United States Information Agency films, which were films that you weren't supposed to show in the United States. There was a law because they could be used for propaganda to support the current administration. So these were films that were distributed overseas, and they were, and so Stevens, as his name is, that was the guy who was running it, and Frank got one of these awards, and we went down there and filmed during Mardi Gras. And he picked out this guy, Kid Chic Cola, to focus on him. But Frank was also working in an old-fashioned way, so he recorded Kid Chic Cola in interviews, but he had an actor do all his lines. That's scripted. And the film was 35 millimeter, great big heavy camera. and a guy named Nigel Noble did the sound, and we filmed one of those lines, second line things, and did a lot of stuff around New Orleans. And the film is cut together as a musical piece, and if you watch it, it's kind of old-fashioned film looking now, but it has a beautiful quality of those old-fashioned 35 millimeter films, and that's what I remember about it. But the biggest thing that came, and this was part of Folk Streams and was enabled by Folk Streams, was the rescue of that film. That film was made at the time, and I had a 16 millimeter print, a reduction print of the 35, and I stored it in my basement at my house in Virginia. And when I got it out of the basement to look at it, it was completely moldy and all streaks and stuff like that. So I said, where's the original for this film? Well, Frank had died in the 70s, and the laboratory that handled that film, the Lux Laboratory, had folded, and all that stuff had been dispersed, and they threw it out. They'd write letters. If you didn't pick it up, they'd throw it in the garbage. And so all the negatives on that film were lost. And I found a print in, there was I said, well, the USI library, don't they have some of these prints left over? They didn't have anything. I located one in I think there was one in Israel someplace that wasn't very good shape either, and in a collection in a library in Australia, and also in bad shape. So Facebook was just starting out. And I said, first of all, Frank's widow, his marriage broke to pieces at the end, and Vera, his wife, didn't want anything to do with Frank at this point. And she was an Italian gal, and they had, I said, I wonder if Vera's still alive. So I looked her up, you find on Google, you can find addresses, and I found her place in Boston. She was living there. But nobody there. Nobody answered the phone, nobody there. Oh, she died. She was older than I was, so she was probably in late 70s. Back then, probably maybe 75. So I thought maybe she's dead, but she had a daughter, listed her daughter, Valerie. They had 2 children. That's Frank's daughter. So I looked up Valerie DeCola on Facebook, and sure enough, there was a Valerie DeCola on Facebook. In those days, Facebook wasn't no big. She lived, and said, is this the Valerie DeCola that was Frank's daughter? And after a long while, she didn't check her Facebook much. She wrote back, yes, I am. Said, my mother left. She's living in Italy back down there. She's still alive. And I said, well, we're looking for this print of this film. She said, well, my uncle has a print of that film, I think. So I said, could you think that you could get me in touch? And it turns out the uncle lived in D.C. and, or nephew was his nephew. And he was retired, and he said he had a print. And I said, can you take it, or would you be willing for us to scan it, put it up on Folk Streams? That's an important film, and that you've got to have the own print. So he sent it over to Color Lab, which was my laboratory in Maryland that was handling the film. And I asked him for an estimate of how much it costs to put this, to scan it and make a file of it, and what kind of condition was the print and so forth. And I got this thing. I asked him for it. It's a 16 millimeter film, I said, because I'm thinking this was a 16 millimeter reduction print like I had, about a 20 minutes long. And they got the estimate back. It wasn't that expensive, 16 millimeter. He said, well, that estimate did not work. It's a 35 millimeter print. And I said, how was the shape? He said, it's pristine. It's never been shown. Paid her. So we got the last print of that film, and we went to the American Film.
AFI.
No, not AFI. It's the Film Preservation Foundation.
Oh.
That Scorsese is a big backer of that thing, and we got them to restore the film, make a new negative of that film, and put it in there. So we have now 2 prints in it: the original print, a negative, and an answer print, and another print, that are all in the Southern Folklife collection. So there's a lot of it now down there. And probably one of those prints should go down to New Orleans someplace, but those people down in New Orleans, they're not very good curators, and it's real hot and humid down there. So It's not a good place, you know. But
Well, they got air conditioning.
yeah, well, I guess they do now. But I tell you that was an amazing experience to find that luck out on that film, and that was the beginning of a whole series of films that we found that were down to practically the last print, and we found and restored them, and where the negatives are lost. And this brings you in mind this whole effort now that which can I segue into folks?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you one question about folk streams, because you just brought up it's the sort of archival side of it in a way, with the rescue side. But when you first thought of folk streams, am I right that you thought of it more as a portal for viewing films, not
Yeah.
so much as a
I hadn't thought about the
activist archive?
I hadn't thought of it as
preservation?
an activist archive. We started before YouTube, but we were limited in our thinking because I was thinking in the old-fashioned way of curating top-down, and YouTube's genius was that they didn't care about the curation much as long as it wasn't dirty or something wrong with it. They just wanted people to put it all. So they were more interested in the software, the access to the thing, where everybody putting up more like a business. We were kind of making decisions about what should be on folk streams and what shouldn't. And part of it was, what did the Bible say? Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. I mean, I had made all these films, and I wanted people to see them. And I want anybody that's working film or photography, that's part of it. You want an audience. You want the thing. You want to feel
live.
that
You want it to live.
You want it to live somehow, and you spent, and so it was like vanity. I mean, my films were going to be the first films that up there, you know.
Really? Wow.
And so the first film we put up was Born for Hard Luck,
Yeah.
which is a pretty good film and pretty fun to watch still. But that work started that way, and then the thing started growing. But that was the original impulse for the thing. But then didn't take long, actually, partly because we had a committee, and Paul Jones and Steve Weiss and Tom and every bunch of
Man right there.
Yeah, Joey's the whole. He is our chairman, and Steve. We also gradually gradually I came to realize that what distinguished us from YouTube was the fact that we curated these films and that we were interested in preservation. And as time passed, I mean, at first it was really, really hard to get a filmmaker to agree to put their film on folk streams. Why would I want to put a film that I've been paying for my rent and food and give it away free on folk streams? Why would I do that? Oh, this is it's a very famous film. I made a lot of money from this film. I said, well, we'll see. And what happened was films became so, not only was every film in the world on YouTube, but every film that was ever made, you know, you had all this thing. So they became sort of like, it used to be kind of romantic. You could pick up girls by saying, oh, hey, I'm a filmmaker. Maybe that was I mean,
everybody's
that's just
a
stupid.
filmmaker.
Yeah,
Everybody's a
I mean,
filmmaker,
that's a great line. And sort of that thing is now like, oh.
Right.
And so that was the big change. So what we really realized over this course, that what we really were about was preservation, and not just and part of preservation was, and that was clear from the beginning, was if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears, was there ever a tree that fell? Was there ever a film that was made? So you had to have access in order for people to care about it, and for it to be. And you know who was a really impulsive? And that was a guy. You ever heard of this guy, Rick Prelinger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's a famous, really interesting guy, and he makes films from old films. He has this huge
Prelinger archive.
Archive. It's a wonderful. All
Teaches
these
it.
old films about how to brush your teeth and how
Industrial
to be
films.
industrial films. They're really, really interesting now. And he collected them, where they were being thrown out of collections and libraries. And he's got this marvelous Prelinger collection, which he sold to the Library of Congress. I think, God, what could I sell?
And then,
folk dreams
but
for?
but he's rebuilt, there's another Prelinger collection.
Yeah.
He can't stop.
He can't. He's a really interesting. But he wrote a letter for me at the early days. What happened was, this. Let me tell you how the folk. Can I tell you how folk streams came to being?
1999?
1999. I was interested in the fact that, hey, how are you? Napster had happened. You know Napster? Remember that in the late 90s? And everybody was getting that music free. And I was thinking, well, that's interesting. I bet you could. I bet you if it's digital, maybe it could work in movies. So anyway, I got a call from a guy. It was back in that period. I was early on to using the internet. I used the internet in making Willa in about 1993 and 94. I joined AOL, and the idea was that you could. We wrote the script as a kind of group. And can you imagine what it would have been like writing the script, mailing the script, getting the thing, sending it back? Well, we discovered email. And you could send a script, and the person could write, make the changes on, send it back the same hour the next day. I mean, it was really, got to dial up AOL. And we could dial up, and we could use this to write the script. I'm sure this was the first film that, well, it was the first film that was ever done, and I'm sure that's the first film that was ever cut in the world digitally, because we got there wasn't any programs that and Adobe Premiere was coming out with Adobe was coming out with a beta test in Adobe Premiere, and we said, well, we'll try to do it digitally, and not work the old way where you had to cut the film together. It was a nightmare. You can't believe it. Nothing worked.
What year was that?
About 1995 we started, but the film was made shot by then, and then a lot of stuff happened, and then my son got killed in the middle of the shooting, and it was really.
And his computer interest is part of what.
Yeah, he was doing.
for
Yeah,
your-
that was the seeding, and my son was doing all this. He was using up. We had dial-up, and we were getting these phone bills for like $400 a month because he was going down there and playing these MOGs or MUDs. They're interactive stories. They tell stories to each other. Very interesting folkloric, I guess it is. We wrote about it a little bit. And he was doing all this stuff, and I said, "That computer shit is not going to last. Why don't you get a job?" You know, it was a typical parent.
Get off my lawn.
So he went. So he went to the University of North Santa Cruz and got very involved in because then he came back, lost his. They told him he was too immature to last at Santa Cruz, so they sent him back and he got a job, and he was getting up real early in the morning so he could go to George Mason University and use the free internet because we told him he couldn't use our phones anymore because dial-up is all long distance, and he got too stressed out. I mean, his job started at 5. He'd leave it, wouldn't tell us, and get up at like midnight and drive into George Mason and use the computer. And he was so sleepy on the way home, he crashed and ran into a truck, just right outside the house. But that was also awakening too, that there was all this going on among young people, training this stuff.
What's always interested me, I don't want to.
Yeah, go ahead.
But
I'm
I
getting
mean,
off.
the same guy that Tom, the same guy that talks about milking this cow and loving the slobber going into the, is by the mid '90s won't shut up about how we need to focus on streaming film, and some of us. I mean, I wasn't doubtful, but I was like, it all looked terrible at that point, right?
Yeah.
And Tom is saying, well, it's going to look great. Just wait. It's and you're right.
Well,
I mean, you had this faith that this was moving, and that we needed to kind of get on board.
yeah, it was. Well, you always thought of it. I mean, when they started putting films on VHS, we thought, oh, well, that we can really distribute. We can get our films out. This is going to be in the streaming. They're going to get it out more. But every one of these innovations meant that the filmmaker got less and less
Right,
money,
right.
and less able to make make a living
Make
from
another
it.
film.
And but it is easier to make films now, much easier and much cheaper than it was in those days. And you had to have laboratories, and the film costs of things. I mean, when we shot The Shaker, when we shot that Singing Stream film, the most thing we spent money on was the film stock
Right.
and the development. We had $90,000. We spent about $40,000 or $50,000 just on film development for its stock. I mean, that was half of the budget. Now you can make a film for nothing. It doesn't cost you anything. Just shoot it on a little chip, you know, and it's beautiful. But it's and so it's enabled this renaissance in filmmaking now. This huge, I mean, the talent and everything. But I think that one of the things that has fallen out, but I'll be a little preachy here, is that what's happened is it all connected with the fake news and the emotional tenet of the country is that we've moved from a world of reason and analytical reason, which is the reason, like when I was in college, that was the kind of ideal out of the Enlightenment, that people can overcome superstition. They can science and everything. If you just analyze it carefully and think carefully enough, it's thinking. Now we're on a much more emotional plane. It's much more like cave painters painting pictures in caves. These videos are like that. They appeal to you emotionally and they charge you emotionally, but there's not the analytical aspect, and this has to do with our politics now. It's a real failing. And I was talking to Tom. The real problem now is that all of us spend most of our time in front of a computer screen. We very seldom look outside that, and that's our world. So that the world of forming these worlds and these images and influencing us by images and they're all secondary. They're images. Like, I remember showing a bunch of Boy Scouts a picture from a magazine of a pizza, and they said, "Hey, what's that?" And he said, "It's a pizza." And I said, "It's not a pizza. If you think it's a pizza, you try eating that page." It's not a pizza. It's an image of a pizza. And this is anybody as a filmmaker or an artist or photographer, I suppose, or a human being, is the number one problem is how do you touch reality without living some kind of hack cliche thing that you've been given by advertisement and so forth. I mean, I felt bad. I know this is going to be politically incorrect, but I felt bad. I really enjoyed the Native American thing presentation last night, and I especially enjoyed the banter of the MC of the whole thing. But I felt all that stuff about we are the sacred people. We are. It's like they're living in a. It's like it's sort of like living in an image of what they were, and rather than that, and I suppose we all do sort of thing, but I didn't. It felt cliche and false to me, and so that was my opinion. Very not PC at all, but it's true. I think everybody does it, and but your struggle in life is to somehow through friends, sex, I don't know what, you somehow get beyond that. And,
Beyond the screen.
Well, yeah, and it never ends. There's never end to that garbage coming in your head, and you've got to go. It's what Jesus said when he said, "Look," he said, everybody says the beasts and the birds, they have places to nest, but the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. You go on. And that's hard for Christians to even, they don't give they're so stuck in their little preoccupations. But that's a very important issue in life. If I was to talk to Dan Patterson about that would be what we'd probably be talking about. Yeah.
You all got questions for Tom?
Oh, you want to hear about the future folk stream?
That's what we need.
Don't you, Joey?
Yes, I do.
What is the future of folk streams? How
Well-
many films
well,
on
here's
folk
a- here's
streams
a
now?
big
How many
issue.
films on folk streams?
There's
so
about
people-
350 films on folk streams, and they're coming to us now because people want to be on folk streams. Folk streams gives
It's a brand.
It's a brand almost like this. So we've got enough. We got with a new. We also finally got a new look to folk streams, which is nicer. And I still work with Steve Knobloch, who was the original designer. He designed that thing in 2002, and we were using the same folk stream thing with the same design until 2017. And we finally, Steve, we tried all these different platforms, and none of them we could get Steve to do, but we finally got it redesigned, and the basis of the thing is still Steve's old software platform. But one of the things that Steve worked out was a thing called My Folk Streams. And My Folk Streams, you can you imagine, 350 films, and you've got probably close to that many filmmakers, and we're trying to keep up their biographies, their email current, their all that stuff. Can you imagine the amount of work finding, little petty work? Would you send me your latest bio? I used to write them and say, please, send me your birthday and your death day. But I do have their birthday on it. I do, but I always think there's a pause when I do that on the phone. And then and then there's a little can you? We have and then you work with people like C.C. Conway sitting there. For 20 years, I've asked you, will you please send the dink copy over to... Okay.
But or any digitized money with Elva. I didn't need that, Tom, but now.
Yeah, right. You need it in a safe place, your little thing. You got to get out of your house and all that. That's what I want to do. And the other thing, you'd be surprised how many filmmakers have their stuff in closets now. They don't know. Well, I'm waiting for the big day when I'm going to make it again. Or, yeah, you can stream it, but I want to see if I'm going to put it on Canopy. I'm going to make money through Canopy. That's another streaming site.
Sell it to an
Sell
archive.
it.
They're going to give me a lot of money for it.
So the big breakthrough came with the films of John Cohen, which this year he finally, he heard the owl call and mortality knocking on the door. And those films really influenced me. I love those films, those two films, The High Lonesome and
End of an Old Song.
And you
End
need
of-
the Peruvian ones too.
I know, but I got to work. Now he's got them. Now you got them. Now they get stuck in these certain kind of archives where they have all kinds of legal issues in these archives, especially in the government ones where they can be sued. And this is the trouble with all the universities. And this is what I'm going to segue into this. If you had a friend in the Smithsonian Archives, Pam Whittle. She's retired now. So I had put up a film called The Decomposing Pig. You know that? That's the most powerful, that's the most...
This is one of those films you can't, you just have to see it. Just tell them
No,
you
but
have to see it.
I put it up on folk streams to lift the YouTube numbers. And the YouTube numbers lifted. We was one time that was like the third most
It's a
popular film.
longitudinal film about a decomposing pig.
It was a film made by my friend Jerry Payne. I grew up with this guy.
Time lapse.
A time lapse from the 1960s about how long it takes a pig to decompose with insects.
Gets back to Buñuel that you talked about earlier.
Yeah. That thing, I put it up on YouTube, it went viral. So I said, I'm going to put it up on the YouTube channel, so now I could go to the National Endowment of the Arts and say, look at all the subscriptions we have. On,
This is Tom's,
YouTube.
he said he was kind of an entrepreneur and a
So,
medicine
yeah.
show guy and a trickster.
And then I made a film about how my relationship with Jerry Payne and how we made that film and how that film figured in the breakthrough of forensics and how Jerry moved as a tenant farmer from a very poor farmer in Virginia. It was really about what it was like to be a tenant farmer in Northern Virginia and work on one of these big horse farms. And then Dan Patterson did the contextual stuff on it. And the question was, is this folklore? I don't know. With Dan writing about it, it was. And so it's a great film called Where Do They All Go? When that was a question, Jerry, as a teenager, when I was running around with him, we would go hunting a lot, and we were into bird identification, which consisted of shooting the birds, then identifying them, And his mama would always cook them for us. So no matter what it was. I remember one time, she cooked a raccoon. And they lived in
not a bird, Tom.
No, but it was amazing. And I remember going, and she was a very plain cook. And she was working, they lived on this tenant house on this big farm, Langolan, which was a 5,000-acre horse farm that Jock Whitney had bought for his bride. And she put that coon, I swear to God, looked like a dog, on the table, just on a platter. It wasn't a single thing with it. It was just a cooked coon. It was funny. And Jerry, but his mother loved us, and his mother was a big force in my life. And Jerry and I we were two boys that could do no wrong with her. And we roamed, had bicycles and guns, and we could roam all of Northern Virginia. At that time was very country, and we could go everywhere on these things. So it was a wonderful couple of years. And we rode the school bus together. That's where we met. The school bus was like to Marshall, where I was going to high school, was an hour and a half on the school bus from my house. And he rode half of it. And so we'd sit in there in the school bus, and it was a lot of fun. Talk birds and sing songs and stuff like that. And the school bus drivers were all teenagers then. They were all high school seniors. I remember getting a fight with one of them when I was in the 8th grade and gotten put off the bus. Yeah, can you imagine getting a fist fight with your school bus driver now? We got to make America great again. I wanted to tell Steve, tell him that story you tell him of that about Trump supporters and Trump and folklorists.
Yeah, well, I heard this from you. And it's actually inspired some projects that we're doing at City Lord. But Tom said, there's 360 films on folk streams, and every one of those filmmakers hates Trump. And every one of the people in those films loves Trump. But it gave me the idea that folklorists do have an ability to cross that divide somehow, and we're working on trying to figure out some ways of doing that, sort of based on that idea.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, we've been dilly-dallying folk streams. The real issue is where folk streams belongs and whether it belongs in an institution like a university or if it can maintain its 501(c)(3) independence, which allows this more entrepreneurial flexibility that Steve has in his organization. And look at the stuff that he would. I mean, once you get in that university, Tom worked at Duke, for a long time. When you get in that university and the lawyers get a hold of things, and what is the university interested in? Primarily now, universities, there are certainly individuals in these universities, but the university as a whole is interested in how can we survive? How can we raise money? How can we get grants? How can we do this? And if you make a grant through, the way I understood, you make a grant through the university is going to take 40 or 50% of it for their overhead.
Not always, but sometimes.
Sometimes, and we worked around that with one of our grants. But but so we have this 501(c)(3), and Dan, who is very loyal and grew up loyal to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, he feels that it should stay there where we have this affiliation with the Southern Folklife Collection, a very important affiliation, I might say, because it is an archive, and we put our stuff there, and Steve is delighted for us to archive stuff. But I can tell he doesn't like it when we come in with if we come in with a giant collection, that requires a lot of cataloging. That's a lot of work for those guys. And at one point, I met a guy from a high school classmate of mine who was well placed in, I went to public school for a while, but the last 2 years in school I went to Episcopal High School, which was a very important Southern school for the Southern establishment in the 1950s. And I had a friend, Shep Ainsley, who was a well-connected person in Atlanta, and he was a friend of a guy named Tom Keenan. Well, Keenan is a big supporter of everything in Chapel Hill. And Tom Keenan said, he walked over to the people in Chapel Hill, said, look, I'll give you want $1 million to them, and I'll give you half of it. You got to raise the other money. Well, who's going to do it? They just dropped the ball on that. No, it's not in my interest, it's not in, the only person who wants it is Tom, and he's not even a faculty member. And me. And so that thing fell down. I mean, we could have probably, but maybe I should go to Keenan and say, don't do it through the university, do it through us. But he wants to influence the university. But this is the issue, is how, now if we have this My Folk Streams thing where the filmmakers have control over their data, limited control, not complete control, but they can go in and they can change their biography, they can update their email, they can add facts that they've forgotten to the film, they can even put contextual things on. They can do that themselves under, our supervision, but they can do it. We don't have to be like a puppet. Now they say, Tom, move this. Would you go back and take that comma out of this and write this other sentence? Okay, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Okay, I'm listening. We'll do that. So it's a lot of work doing that. It takes a lot of time. And I think that would be a big thing. And anybody staffs it would who was new staffing at Folk Streams that goes to anybody else that's interested in this thing, it will be a lot easier for you to operate it than it was before. It's very easy now with the new administration to put up new films and do it. But each of these films, you'd be surprised how, if a filmmaker's really interested in this film, like Roberta Conlow, the person that did Clotheslines, I get an email from her every day for the past 2 months. Can you change? They're very, it's important for these people. You can imagine it's their baby, so they're working with them.
I mean, I think that's part of the issue, is the difference between a sort of independent startup or an independent filmmaker and a institutional.
Yeah.
And I think we talked at breakfast a little bit about the legal. Universities and major archives have intellectual property lawyers who are constantly saying yes, no, and you haven't had to do that.
Yeah.
And I think, on the other hand, if it doesn't move to an institution, it's really vulnerable.
Yeah.
501c3s are, if Steve doesn't get up every day and work on behalf of his 501c3, nobody else is. And I think that's the I don't know
that's
what
a
the
dilemma.
answer is. That's the dilemma.
Well, and also there's a lot of these films don't have the releases the way intellectual property lawyers
The way university would want them.
Yeah.
Right.
And so what will that do to the film?
So then they say we can't use it. It's here, but it can't be. It can be only seen in this room. Can't be.
Right.
Can't be streamed. And anyway, Bruce.
You can talk about where it gets parked, but you're 78 now?
79.
79. You've been the guiding genius of this.
Well,
What happens?
Without you,
huh?
no matter where it goes.
Part this moral coil. Who keeps this going?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think that's an issue. I mean, that's my advantage in the way, because when I talk to these old filmmakers, hey, we're sort of this thing. I know what they're feeling. Yeah. And I think that's true, but I think that I don't know. I mean, we're going to try to work it out in the next few years. We've made an application to we got, after Bill Ferris left the National Endowment of the Humanities, they'd given us a planning grant to start. That's how I got started. When Bill Ferris was last year, then the Republicans got in, and they had an aversion to Bill Ferris. Let me tell you another story. When I found out about the streaming thing, so I wrote Bill Ferris a letter. I think I got the letter. I said, Bill, it's going to be streaming on the internet. This is going to allow us to niche market these folklore films. It's going to be a really great thing. And he agreed with me. So I went down to his office. It was his last year in the Clinton administration. And we went to the endowment, and he was very kind of interested in that. So they brought in the head of public programs. And she was a woman who had gotten her PhD in French Renaissance studies of some sort, and wasn't exactly like, she liked Bill Ferris very much and thought that what he was doing was interesting. There was this reaction. So I could tell there was a little tension, and she said, well, you can't, that streaming stuff is never going to go. What makes you think streaming is going to be a big thing? Didn't talk like that. I'm just exaggerating. She was a perfectly nice person, but she said, look, she said, we did the Ken Burns thing, a couple of those Ken Burns movies, and it turned out when we looked in the idea of streaming those films, it would cost more for us to get the proper releases for the video streaming than the entire production cost. So you've got all this stock footage and stuff like in your movies. How can you deal with the copyright? So, well, our films aren't like Ken Burns. He uses material like we make. Our films are original material, and if they're photographs, they're usually family photographs. We're not using things from the Getty Archives and stuff like that. Okay, occasionally, I didn't tell her that occasionally that's true, but by and large, they're not. So I said, they're not the same thing. And Bill, of course, agreed with me, but she didn't think that was even going to happen. So they gave us a $50,000 planning grant, which was a lot of money in that period. And that's what started, that was the money that really got Folk Streams going. But at that time, it was so hard to get the filmmakers to contribute their films. And so I had to put up all my films first as an example.
What you wanted to do anyway.
Well, I had my...
You wanted Dink and your films.
Well, Dink, yes. I started with Dink, yeah. That's 1995. Still in her place. You go find it. All right. But anyway, that's good. Got going. Now, after that, we made another application, thinking we got a planning grant. This is going to be the implementation grant for $150,000. We passed with flying colors. The peer group gave us highest marks, but the council, which was the Bush appointees, said no. And why? They said. I said, why? You gave it, the peer group said we're 100%, and you guys are saying no. And so they hummed and hawed and said, because folk streams is films that are made in folk streams are too celebratory. They're not scholarly critically enough. That was their reasoning. They're not critical. So well, we were developing all this criticism and contextualization that supports that. That was it. It was a political move. They wanted films, and I thought, oh, gee, they got an initiative called, it was an initiative, We the People. Oh, man, they're putting money into that thing. Oh, what? Well, folklore, We the People, right? You know what they meant by that? The Founding Fathers, because they were exporting democracy. This was a time when they were exporting all these democratic things in overseas and so forth. So films about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and people like that. And so we couldn't get any traction in folks. It was like, you all are and it's true, we're part of the fragmentation of the culture. Folk streams is a part of that. But in a way, it also gives us a sense of a national heritage as a unity. And it is, in a way, very conservative in some ways because of that. I mean, we do have a lot of immigrant groups and the various things that we've been opening to, but the standard, the stuff that we're really full of is all the kind of, mostly African-American, Anglo-Saxon, Southern things and stuff like that. And
well, it's not meant to, I mean, it was never conceived to be, a holistic representation of all quadrants of American culture.
Well, it wasn't, but it was somewhat, I used to go and do a lot of research at the Library of Congress and they have Farm Security Administration photographs. And those photographs influenced, I used to look at those photographs to do the sets for the fairy tale films that we'd set back in that period. And so those photographs were extremely important to me to have a feeling for the culture and the culture my parents grew up in, the Depression culture. And it was a tremendously romantic interest in all that stuff, but it was extremely strong, and my image of America was formed by that Farm Security Administration photographs. And that's what I think Folk Streams, I mentioned that in the press points, that Folk Streams does that to a certain extent.
Cumulatively.
And it's more diverse than a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, now the stuff that's coming in is very diverse. I mean, because the immigrant cultures are, people trying to maintain this stuff.
Well, so how are you floating with UNC? I may have missed, but what's the relationship?
UNC, we have a very cooperative relationship with UNC. The server is run by iBiblio, which is
Paul
part
Jones.
of Paul Jones and part of the library system.
But see, Paul Jones is like, I mean, Bruce's question to you about what happens after you.
Paul Jones won.
We could be asking Paul Jones the same thing, because Paul Jones is this very charismatic, brilliant poet who started this thing iBiblio and really saw the internet as, I mean, he quit emailing and started tweeting and like,
Drives you crazy.
I mean, he's always like
Yeah.
up here, but when he goes, I don't know, it'll totally change the way UNC Libraries operates in terms of the internet. It's not going to go away. But Paul Jones he's a maverick.
Yeah, Maverick. And then the other person is Steve Weiss and the Center for Southern Folk Life. And that was really, in the background of that was Dan Patterson. That's another one of his things that he's done.
Sure.
He really started that. And he's always taken a kind of a modest role in that, but he probably was the instigator of that whole thing. And Steve is he's a curator in the latest of several people who have been employed in this job in the library. And his job is a thankless job, you know, all this stuff coming in, and maybe these are treasures and stuff again, but you remember what Wendell Berry said, never have so many possessions that you'd be happy that your house would burn up. And and that's why I think people in archives get to feel like that sometimes. And one of the things, as you get older too, Tom's a photographer, one of the things that you find in your life as a photographer or as a creator is you created all these things, they then become burdens that you have to look after. You have to look after your own work. And this is it increasingly takes
Well, that gets back to
time.
the institution. I mean, that is the value of, I mean, what I say to people that are wondering whether to put their work, say, at the Archive of Documentary Arts at Duke, in all seriousness, although it always makes people laugh, I use the example of the Perpetual Care Cemetery.
Yeah.
You know, it gets mowed
The tomb
every
I was
week,
talking about at the beginning.
and somebody cuts the trees down when the hurricane comes, and you've bought into the Perpetual Care Cemetery. And Bruce is putting things in the Perpetual Care Library of Congress. I mean, we all have to put things, and you do wonder what happens when Todd Harvey's gone, or or Betsy Peterson is gone, or what. But
That's why I chose the library.
right,
But it's a little different because that's telling people, yes, people will always be able to find that.
right.
But Folk Streams is out there making it
The
accessible.
accessibility.
And yes, somebody could put all the films in the library and they would always be there, but the question is whether it would always be out there for people
Right.
to access it.
Well, that's the idea, the tomb. Remember that I was talking about that tomb metaphor about that film of the biblical. And you know, who knows? I mean, maybe I think you have to have almost like a childlike trust, you know, in some things. One thing you know is things change, and you don't know what's going to happen and how things will be. Maybe, you know, 100 years from now, somebody will be fussing around in a box in the Library of Congress, and there's somebody finds something from Bruce, and it's been lost, like the scene in the little sleigh and in the movie Heroes Bud, and you wonder, but I mean, you can't. There's a certain point where you say, God damn, I can't concern myself too much about that because I'll never get it right. It'll never be, no matter how secure you think it is, it's never going to be completely secure. I went down to Chapel Hill and I had an epiphany a few years ago. I was looking through footage in the Wilson Library of Singing Stream, old material to use in the new Singing Stream film. And it was between it was after all the undergraduates left, so there was very few people on campus. There were a lot of foreign students, but it was dreary. The campus was, it's not like we walk down Chapel Hill where all the students, all those young people, just, healthy and vibrant, beautiful, and walking around and like little baubles, and you get, and then now they're all, sort of, homesick Chinese, and stuff like that. And it was a foggy day, and I was up there in the Wilson Library. It's a great big granite building. That's where the books are all kept. And you go, and I used to get lost in the stacks back in there. We had to look back in there. And the only way I could find my way out, I'd start, "Hey, Steve!" I would yaw, like calling a cow. And then I'd hear him, and I'd know how to move out of the stacks. It's so funny. And then I was sitting there, and I said, "God damn, if that library gets a hole in the roof, that granite library gets a hole in the roof, how much money would it cost to fix that one leak?" It probably cost $1 million to fix that leak. How is that library now, which is all online, who's using the library, and with Google, how is that going to survive? How is that going to survive? Meanwhile, all this stuff is coming, all these internet courses, and coming and doing the thing. The MIT, all the accounting courses are provided by Brigham Young University now, and I had a friend who just got his in Poland. That took a course in coding on MIT, got the top grade, and this. I say, well, gee, and it's like very disruptive because you get one big teacher with a fantastic good course on the history of China. Do you think any other teacher has a chance if it's an online thing? No, there's no jobs anymore. It's just like anything that's happened is disruptive. I said, that's going to happen to universities. And they're desperate now as they become more desperate, and it becomes more petty as they try to, anything worthwhile you can't get paid for. And this is what happens. This could happen to these institutions. So I'm thinking, I'm just throwing that out there. I have no solutions. But I'm going out with, if anybody wants to continue this conversation, what time is it now?
It's 4 o'clock.
Time flies when you're having fun. That's true.
It's about 12:20.
It is. I'm having a great time. I really am. Thank you. I'm vanity, and vanity all is vanity, and thank you. You gave me a little dose of that.
Well, thank you, Tom.
And I want to thank everybody. You'd be surprised. I mean, this Folkstream thing is not, it's really a lot of people. Can you imagine? Not only the committee, and Joey and Tom and Stephen and everybody, but all the people that worked on the films. All that work that went into. I remember when I was working on the Shaker film, and I told that I went down. This is the early days, and Dan had me down at Chapel Hill. I'm giving a talk, and all these graduates, and I told him I've been working on that film for 4 years. And this undergraduate, my God, you worked on that film for 4 years. Didn't they want to give you a PhD after that? And I was, at that time, the academic world thought filmmaking was just, that wasn't serious. Writing a PhD was serious. It had to be in print. All right.
Thank you all. It's been great.
Thank you, everybody.
How much longer are you here to continue the conversation?
Well,
Today and tomorrow?
I'm going to be here. No, I'm leaving pretty early tomorrow morning.
Okay.
That's I'll be here in the afternoon, I guess.
Okay.
But I have to have my nap.